The world as we know it nearly ended on a quiet Monday night in September 1983. There were no grand speeches, no public air raid sirens, and no frantic news bulletins. While millions of people across the globe were sleeping, finishing dinner, or tucking their children into bed, the machinery of the apocalypse had hummed to life in a secret bunker south of Moscow. For those charged with monitoring the pulse of the Cold War, the nightmare had finally arrived. The sensors were clear, the computers were screaming, and the protocol was absolute. The United States had launched a nuclear strike. To understand how close we came to the edge, we must first understand the climate of 1983. It was perhaps the most dangerous year of the entire Cold War, a period of paranoid tension that rivaled the Cuban Missile Crisis. Relations between the two superpowers had decayed to a freezing point. Earlier that year, President Ronald Reagan had famously labeled the Soviet Union an evil empire. In response, the Kremlin, led by the aging and ailing Yuri Andropov, became convinced that the West was no longer interested in containment, but in a preemptive first strike to decapitate the Soviet leadership. This tension was pushed to a breaking point on September 1, 1983, when Soviet interceptors shot down Korean Airlines Flight 7 after it strayed into Soviet airspace. All 269 people on board were killed, including a U.S. Congressman. Reagan called it a massacre and a crime against humanity. In Moscow, the military went on high alert, genuinely fearing that the inevitable American retaliation was coming. It was in this atmosphere of extreme distrust and hair-trigger tempers that Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov reported for duty. On the night of September 26th, Petrov was the duty officer at Serpukhov 15, a secret command center that monitored the Soviet Union's early warning satellites. His job was simple but terrifying. Monitor the satellite network, known as OKO, and notify his superiors if an American launch was detected. If he reported a launch, the Soviet leadership would have mere minutes to decide whether to launch a massive retaliatory strike before their own silos were destroyed. Just past midnight, the sirens began to wail. A giant red screen at the front of the bunker flashed a single word in Cyrillic: launch. The system reported that a single Minuteman intercontinental ballistic missile had been fired from a base in the United States and was currently hurtling towards Soviet territory. Petrov sat frozen in his chair. He had been trained for this, but the reality was staggering. He looked at his team. Men were staring at him, waiting for the command to pass the alert up the chain of Cold War command. But Petrov hesitated. He had a gut feeling that something wasn't right. He knew that if the United States were to start a nuclear war, they wouldn't do it with a single missile. A first strike would involve hundreds of missiles launched simultaneously to overwhelm defenses and destroy the enemy's ability to hit back. A single missile made no tactical sense. Petrov decided to write it off as a system malfunction. He told his superiors it was a false alarm. But then the system screamed again. Second missile, third missile, fourth, fifth. The computers were now tracking 5 incoming nuclear warheads. The siren's howl was deafening. The digital displays were flashing missile attack in bright red letters. According to the technology, the missiles were now only 20 minutes from impact. The pressure on Petrov was unimaginable. He was a cog in a rigid military machine, where disobedience was often met with imprisonment or worse. His electronic maps showed the trajectories. The satellites were supposedly seeing the heat signatures of the rocket motors, and the computer's reliability was touted as flawless. Petrov had no other data to go on. The ground-based radar, which could provide secondary confirmation, would not be able to see the missiles until they cleared the horizon, which would leave the Soviet Union with almost no time to react. He held the phone in his hand, the direct line to the Soviet General Staff. If he confirmed the attack, the Soviet Union would launch its entire arsenal. Within the hour, hundreds of millions of people in the United States, Europe, and Russia would be dead. The Northern Hemisphere would likely enter a nuclear winter, ending modern civilization. Petrov looked at the flashing lights and made a decision based not on data, but on human intuition. He noted that the newly deployed Oko satellite system had been rushed into service and had a history of glitches. He also stuck to his initial logic. 5 missiles were still too few. If the Americans were going to do it, they would do it with everything they had. He stayed his hand. He told his superiors with a forced calmness he didn't feel that the system was malfunctioning. He waited. The minutes ticked by in agonizing silence. Each second was a gamble with the lives of every human being on Earth. If he was wrong, he was allowing his country to be destroyed without a fight. He sat in the dim light of the bunker, eyes fixed on the clock, waiting for the flashes of light that would signal the end of his world. The 20-minute mark passed, then 25, then 30. There were no explosions. There were no reports of mushroom clouds over Soviet cities. The screens eventually went dark, the sirens fell silent, and the missiles simply vanished. Petrov had been right. It was a false alarm. The investigation that followed revealed a bizarre technical fluke. The Soviet satellites had been positioned in such a way that they mistook the high-altitude reflection of the sun off the top of clouds for the thermal exhaust of launching missiles. The alignment was a once-in-a-lifetime celestial event that the system's programmers had never anticipated. You might think that Stanislav Petrov was hailed as a hero. He was not. To the Soviet military hierarchy, Petrov's decision was an embarrassment. It highlighted the flaws in their multi-billion ruble early warning system, and more importantly, it showed that a subordinate had dared to question the machines and the orders of the state. Petrov was interrogated, reprimanded for failing to properly fill out his logbooks during the crisis, and eventually moved to a less sensitive post. He took early retirement shortly after and lived in relative poverty and obscurity in a small apartment in Fryazino. The world did not even learn of the incident until the late 1990s, when the memoirs of a former Soviet commander were published. When the story finally broke, the magnitude of Petrov's decision finally became clear to the public. He had been the thin line between existence and extinction. In his later years, Petrov was modest about his role. He often said, "I was just at the right place at the right time." He didn't consider himself a hero. He considered himself a man who did his job by using his common sense. The 1983 incident serves as a chilling reminder of the fragility of our world. It shows that even with the most advanced technology, the fate of humanity can often rest in the hands of a single individual and their capacity for critical thinking. In an era where we rely more and more on automated systems and artificial intelligence, the story of Stanislav Petrov is more relevant than ever. Petrov passed away in 2017 at the age of 77. He didn't have a state funeral, and he never sought the spotlight. But every year on September 26th, a small group of historians and peace activists remember the man who didn't push the button. He reminded us that in the cold, binary world of military conflict, the most powerful weapon we possess is not a missile, but the human conscience. We are here today, watching this, because one man chose to doubt the machines and believe in a world that was worth saving.